Every music lover hears the word symphony on a regular basis. We attend concerts of our symphony, listen to works written for a symphony orchestra, some of them bearing that adjective symphonic or simply being called a symphony. There is hardly any classical concert without at least one symphony on the program. Why this word became almost synonymous with the musical concert work on a big scale? When looking through season programs of virtually every single symphony orchestra in the world, there is one name that appears there at least once every year. Every conductor has his works in repertory. One cannot imagine an educated person not to know that name. Beethoven, not only a giant in music, but also a household name. Think of fate, that comes to mind instantly. Unattainable love? The moon, perhaps that sounds familiar. Undoubtedly, this particular Viennese classic left the undying mark on our civilization. His greatest achievement lay in the symphonic work. The set of 9 symphonies stand out as a model for future generations of composers. Although Beethoven did not invent the symphony, he made it a breakthrough vehicle of artistic expression. Before him, many composers were writing symphonies, including his great Viennese colleagues, Mozart and Haydn. The term symphony comes from the Greek symphonia, meaning agreement or concord of sound, or symphonos, harmonious. At first, this term was often applied to any musical composition employing an ensemble of voices or instruments playing simply together, in harmony as the term suggested. Then, in Baroque era, composers used the term to signify instrumental music, often preceding an opera or oratorio. In Italy, it was a standard structure of 3 contrasting movements: fast, slow, fast and dance-like. It is this form that is often considered as the direct forerunner of the orchestral symphony. The term overture, symphony and sinfonia were widely regarded as interchangeable for much of the 18th century. Later on, symphony became a standalone composition. A particularly strong area of support for symphonic performances was the aristocracy. In Vienna, perhaps the most important location in Europe for the composition of symphonies, literally hundreds of noble families supported musical establishments, generally dividing their time between Vienna and their ancestral estate. The symphonic 3-movement form has gradually developed to 4 movements. An opening allegro in so-called sonata form, with 2 contrasting themes, development and recapitulation. Then a slow movement, such as adagio. A minuet or later a scherzo. And a final allegro in either a rondo or a sonata form, sometimes mixture of both. Early symphonies were composed in massive quantities. Even greatest composers did not limit themselves in this field. Mozart wrote 41, Haydn, a true record breaker, 104. At the beginning of the 19th century, Beethoven elevated the symphony from an everyday genre to a supreme form in which composers strove to reach the highest potential in music in just a few works. Something must have changed in the social fabric that the secular music stopped being a mere entertainment for higher privileged classes, although it still relied heavily on financial support from the aristocratic or royal courts. The French Revolution of 1789 sent not only political ripples across the continent with its abolition of feudalism, and regrettably sent also rolling royal and aristocratic heads, but brought about the democratization of arts. Creation of the Paris Conservatoire in 1795 fundamentally changed the existing model of musical education. Based on an example of 16th and 17th century Napolitan conservatori orphanages, where admission was by competitive examination and tuition was free, Conservatoire de Paris allowed democratic access to musical knowledge and training. French Revolution inspired many composers to write revolutionary music, daring to break with existing aesthetical constraints, larger in scale and often more straightforward and brutal in their choice of means of musical expression. Musicians were putting on their concerts in large venues, capable of hosting a growing number of spectators who were paying for admission. Orchestras had to grow accordingly in order to be simply audible. New ideas of enlightenment penetrated the minds of the learned aristocracy and bourgeoisie of the emerging middle class. A music concert stopped being a mere entertainment. The art in general reverted to its origins, as in ancient Greece. Participating in the artistic performance was again meant to be cathartic, putting the audience through a process of purification and purgation of emotions, resulting in renewal and restoration. All of these processes did not happen at once. We can observe this new wave already in the works of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, one of the many talented sons of the great Johann Sebastian. Not surprisingly, his most notable works are none other than sinfonias, symphonies. Joseph Haydn did not simply please his aristocratic patrons, his daring musical creations must surely raised their eyebrows. Mozart wasn't too musically polite either. Not surprisingly, the first two orchestral works Beethoven wrote after an extended period of studies and building his career as a concert pianist in Vienna bear some stylistic similarities to works of Haydn and Mozart. However, Beethoven would not be himself if he did not shock his audience with his debut. Symphony No. 1 in C major, written in 1800, starts in the most unusual manner. First of all, the listener is greeted with a bizarre combination of pizzicato, means plucked strings, and woodwinds. This unruly, almost rude chord is not only a dissonance, but, to make things even worse, in the wrong key. We are left to wonder about the actual tonality throughout the whole slow introduction. Generations of composers knew, and listeners took it for granted, that, for instance, a symphony in C major should start with a C major chord. What was good for others was not good enough for Beethoven. Listen to that. C7, a dominant, leading to F major. G7, A minor, D7, again, G, not C. Let's listen to it. For a long long stretch of music we are completely unsure about the home key. The composer misleads us. But now? Well, we are almost there. Now. Finally, C major. What a glorious opening. The second symphony opens in D major as suggested in its title. But then, so much for politeness. The third movement, Scherzo, and the finale are filled with Beethovenian musical jokes, which shocked the sensibilities of many contemporary critics. One Viennese critic for the Zeitung für die elegante Welt, newspaper for the elegant world, famously wrote of the symphony that it was a hideously writhing wounded dragon that refuses to die, but writhing in its last agonies and, in the fourth movement, bleeding to death. First of all, Beethoven refuses to name the third movement a minuet. It is a scherzo, meaning joke in Italian. It is much too fast for a conventional minuet. Then, those fast-switching, highly irregular dialogues between strings and the wind section. Just listen. There, so much for jokes. In the next symphony, number 3, we see a very much different picture. As the story told by Beethoven's student Ferdinand Ries has it, the symphony was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, in Ries's own words. In writing this symphony, Beethoven had been thinking of Buonaparte, but Buonaparte while he was first consul. At that time, Beethoven had the highest esteem for him and compared him to the greatest consuls of ancient Rome. Not only I, but many of Beethoven's closer friends saw this symphony on his table, beautifully copied in manuscript, with the word Buonaparte inscribed at the very top of the title page, and Luigi van Beethoven at the very bottom. I was the first to tell him the news that Buonaparte had declared himself emperor, whereupon he broke into a rage and exclaimed, "So is he no more than a common mortal? Now, too, he will tread underfoot all the rights of men, indulge only his ambition. Now he will think himself superior to all men, become a tyrant." Beethoven went to the table, seized the top of the title page, tore it in half, and threw it on the floor. The page had to be recopied, and it was only now that the symphony received the title Sinfonia Eroica. I remain doubtful if this story is entirely true. Ries wrote down his reminiscences 33 years after the described event. According to other sources, Beethoven has not entirely broke off with his admiration to Napoleon. Quite possible there was a fit of anger caused by disillusionment, but what we can be sure of, it wasn't prudent for a composer living in Austria, which at that time was a police state, to praise in his work any head of state with which Austria was only a few years earlier in war. Moreover, that war was once again on the horizon. It was for practical and financial reasons that the composer could no longer publicly acknowledge Napoleon as the inspiration for the symphony. Thus, as published in October 1806, the symphony bore the name Eroica with the subtitle Per festeggiare il sovvenire di un gran uomo, to celebrate the memory of a great man. You can see on the front page of an autograph copy the furiously scratched out words Intitolata Buonaparte, a proof of Beethoven's possible tantrum. Regardless of the historical background, the Eroica stands in the history of music as a monument of high significance. It is no more a classical composition playing with formal, harmonic or instrumental conventions. For the first time you can see in it the artist's soul. Beethoven writes about himself. It is the artist himself who is the hero. The symphony is heroic in its internal struggle. Dedications do not change anything. There is no underlying program. Yet, as Sigmund Freud has put it, it communicates directly with our unconscious. Eroica's unsettling character is signaled in the opening two abrupt chords, and further sequences of syncopated rhythms and dissonant harmonies. Just the scale of it was huge, unprecedented, and daunting for its first listeners. Perhaps the most meaningful is the second movement, the Funeral March, being a symphonic poem in itself, here in the historic interpretation of Herbert von Karajan and the Philharmonia Orchestra. Symphony number 4 is not so emotionally demanding as its predecessor, and for a long time it lived in the shadow of the heroic third and faithful fifth. Robert Schumann is said to have called the Fourth Symphony a slender Greek maiden between the two Norse giants. Yet, in the opening adagio, one can hear tones of what became later the domain of Romanticism: mystery, dark, unsettled mood. Leonard Bernstein described it as a mysterious introduction which hovers around minor modes, tiptoeing its tenuous weight through ambiguous, unrelated keys, and so reluctant to settle down into its final B-flat major. Number 4 was also one of the favorite symphonies for the great Yevgeny Mravinsky, here with his Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra. Years 1804 and 1808 proved to be very prolific. Beethoven repeatedly interrupted his work on the Fifth Symphony to prepare other compositions, including the first version of the opera Fidelio, the Appassionata piano sonata, the 3 Razumowski string quartets, the violin concerto, the 4th piano concerto, the 4th symphony, and the Mass in C. The final preparation of the Fifth, which took place in 1807-1808, was carried out in parallel with the Sixth Symphony, which premiered at the same mammoth concert at the Theater an der Wien, one cold December evening of 1808. Famous music critic and writer E.T.A. Hoffmann described the music of the Fifth Symphony with dramatic imagery. Radiant beams shoot through this region's deep night, and we become aware of gigantic shadows which, rocking back and forth, close in on us and destroy everything within us, except the pain of endless longing, a longing in which every pleasure that rose up in jubilant tones sinks and succumbs, and only through this pain, which, while consuming but not destroying love, hope and joy, tries to burst our breasts with full-voiced harmonies of all the passions, We live on and are captivated beholders of the spirits. Beethoven was in his mid-30s during this time. His personal life was troubled by increasing deafness. In the world at large, the period was marked by the Napoleonic Wars, political turmoil in Austria, and the occupation of Vienna by Napoleon's troops in 1805. Again, there is no program, no story relayed by the composer about this music. It speaks for itself, it's absolute. Yet it has gained some symbolic meaning in the future. Since the Second World War, it has sometimes been referred to as the Victory Symphony. V is coincidentally also the Roman numeral character for the number 5, and the phrase V for victory became a campaign of the Allies of World War II after Winston Churchill started using it as a catchword in 1940. Some 30 years after this piece was written, the rhythm of the opening phrase was used for the letter V in Morse code, though this is probably coincidental. Artur Rodzinski, my compatriot, conducted the New York Philharmonic in this movie from 1947. Listen to the mysterious transition between the third and fourth movements. It is worth noticing that introduction of the trombones to symphonic music was yet another new device invented by Beethoven. He began to expand the classical orchestra to meet his creative needs. Other composers, belonging already to the next era, Romanticism, later followed Beethoven's example. As mentioned before, Beethoven's Sixth Symphony was premiered together with the Fifth. What a contrast that must have been. The Sixth bears the title Pastoral, as the composer himself has put it on the title page. Pastoral Symphony, or Recollections of Country Life. It is one of the few so-called programmatic, or as it was fashionable to call them throughout the 19th or even earlier, characteristic compositions in Beethoven's output. He was a lover of nature who spent a great deal of time on walks in the country, frequently leaving Vienna to work in rural locations. Beethoven's letters are filled with declarations of the importance of nature in his life, such as one from 1810. How delighted I will be to ramble for a while through the bushes, woods, under trees, through grass and round rocks. No one can love the country as much as I do, for surely woods, trees and rocks produce the echo that man desires to hear. There are descriptive titles given by the composer to the symphony's 5 movements. First, Awakening of cheerful feelings on arrival in the countryside. Second movement, Scene by the brook. The third, Merry gathering of country folk. The fourth, Thunder, storm. And the fifth, Shepherd's song, cheerful and thankful feelings after the storm. And yet the Sixth Symphony does not aspire to the level of musical realism found in a work like Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique or in Richard Strauss' later tone poems. Scattered comments that Beethoven made in his sketches for the symphony are revealing. The hearers should be allowed to discover the situations. Sinfonia caratteristica, or recollection of country life. All painting in instrumental music is lost if it is pushed too far. Sinfonia pastorella. Anyone who has an idea of a country life can make out for himself the intentions of the composer without many titles. Also without titles, the whole will be recognized as a matter more of feeling than of painting in sounds. Beethoven was right. His music does not need any literary comment. In fact, every single turn of the phrase, melodic shape, orchestration is meaningful. Listen to this rendition of a storm and see how even the way of notation in his own hand reveals direct stream of consciousness from the inspiration to realization. In words of British composer and music author Anthony Hopkins, the Seventh Symphony, perhaps more than any of the others, gives us a feeling of true spontaneity. The notes seem to fly off the page as we are borne along on a flood tide of inspired invention. Beethoven himself spoke of it fondly as one of my best works. Who are we to dispute his judgment? Another admirer, composer Richard Wagner, referring to the lively rhythms which permeate the work, called it the apotheosis of dance. The work was premiered with Beethoven himself conducting in Vienna on 8th of December 1813 at a charity concert for soldiers wounded in the Battle of Hanau. The program also included the patriotic work Wellington's Victory, exalting the victory of the British over Napoleon's France. The orchestra was led by Beethoven's friend Ignaz Schuppanzig and included some of the finest musicians of the day: violinist Louis Spohr, composers Johann Nepomuk Hummel, Giacomo Meyerbeer, and Antonio Salieri. That's Salieri. The Italian guitar virtuoso Mauro Giuliani played cello at the premiere. An orchestra from heaven, was it not? Let's listen to the second movement that the audience in Vienna liked so much that it had to be repeated as an encore. Here in the great interpretation of Yuri Simonov and the Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra. When asked by his pupil Karl Czerny why the eighth was less popular than the seventh, Beethoven is said to have replied, "Because the eighth is so much better." After its first performance on February 27, 1814, at a concert in the Redutensaal in Vienna, a critic wrote that the applause it received was not accompanied by that enthusiasm which distinguishes a work which gives universal delight. In short, as the Italians say, it did not create a furore. Perhaps the reason for such lukewarm reception was the composer's conducting. Reportedly, the orchestra largely ignored his ungainly gestures and followed the principal violinist instead. This symphony is undoubtedly Beethoven's last tribute to symphonic works of Haydn and Mozart, including the only real minuet in the whole cycle of 9 symphonies. It marks a dramatic caesura in composer's life. His audience had to wait another 10 years until the premiere of the 9th and final symphony. Listen to the delightful trio from that rare minuet performed by the San Francisco Symphony under Pierre Monteux. What a beautiful farewell to Beethoven's teacher Haydn and his Ländler-inspired minuets. Probably Beethoven's greatest work, Symphony No. 9 in D minor, was premiered in Vienna on May 7, 1824, following petition signed by a number of prominent Viennese music patrons and performers. Beethoven's initial thought was to have it performed first in Berlin, as he thought that musical taste in Vienna had become dominated by Italian composers and had even dedicated his new work to Friedrich Wilhelm III, King of Prussia. Commission to write the symphony came from the Philharmonic Society of London already in 1817, but the Londoners had to wait until March 1825 to hear the work they paid for. It is one of the most revolutionary pieces in Beethoven's oeuvre. First of all, because of the inclusion of vocal parts, mixed chorus and 4 soloists in symphony's last movement. Beethoven uses parts of the poem An die Freude, Ode to Joy, written by Friedrich Schiller in 1785. The poem became enormously popular as an expression of the sort of Enlightenment idealism which in that decade was spreading throughout the German-speaking parts of Europe in the lodges of the Freemasons. Schiller was said to have conceived his poem under the title An die Freiheit, an ode to freedom, and to have changed it to the title and wording we know in order to avoid problems with the official censor's office. Beethoven became acquainted with Schiller's works already in Bonn while he was growing up there and playing viola in the theater orchestra. Sketches for what was to become the 9th have been traced back to 1815. At that time, Beethoven still had no intention of delivering anything but a wholly instrumental symphony. Finally, in summer 1823, he decided at last to realize his long-cherished wish to set Schiller's Freude, not as a separate work, but as the finale of the new symphony for London, using a theme he had formed the previous fall. The order of the symphony's movements is too highly unusual. It opens with mysterious, oscillating fifths. This expansive allegro is followed not by a slow movement, as prescribed by the classical convention, but by a turbulent scherzo. And that is followed in turn by adagio, lyrical and slow. The final movement, longest of all, is in fact a cantata. There are fragments of the preceding movements quoted here before the solo bass appears to stop the stormy outbursts of the orchestra with Beethoven's own words. "Oh friends, not these sounds. Let us instead strike up more pleasing and more joyful ones." Then the text of the Schiller's ode is introduced first by the bass, then the full chorus. Though Beethoven was totally deaf by the time of the ninth premiere, he insisted to conduct the performance. At the end of the work, he continued to conduct, his head buried in the score, since he could hear neither the music's final bars nor the storm of applause and cheering that followed. Caroline Unger, the Hungarian contralto in the solo quartet, had to tug at his sleeve and turned him to face the audience. She later described the event. "His turning round and the sudden conviction thereby forced on everybody that he had not done so before because he could not hear what was going on, act like an electric shock on all present, and a volcanic explosion of sympathy and admiration followed, which was repeated again and again, and seemed as if it would never end. The expansive theme to which Beethoven set the poem was to be echoed briefly in the finale of Franz Schubert's Final Symphony, also bearing the fateful number 9. He was probably present at the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth. Strangely enough, this work started a superstition among some notable composers that they would die after completing their Ninth Symphony. That list includes, apart from Schubert, names like Anton Bruckner, Antonin Dvorak, and Gustav Mahler. Number 9 has indeed certain striking properties of numbers in general, termed the rules of 9. And those rules are: when any number is multiplied by 9, if the individual digits in the resulting product are added, they will always total 9, as long as you keep summing the digits produced at each step until you get a one-digit number. That will always be 9. Rule 2. If the digits of a number total 9 or a multiple of 9, then the number itself must be a multiple of 9. Rule 3. If a multi-digit number is of multiple of 9, all other numbers formed by rearrangement of its digits also will be multiplies of 9. Then, sure enough, there are 9 rules of 9. It works only in the decimal system we use today that originated in India thousands of years ago. The Pythagoreans thought of 9 as unlucky, as it is 1 short of 10. They considered 10 a symbol of perfection. In Hinduism, 9 is the number of Brahma, the creator. There are 9 muses in Greek mythology. The Greek goddess Demeter, goddess of grain, went for 9 days and 9 nights searching for her beloved daughter Kori. She was only to discover that Kori had been abducted by Hades, god of the underground. Jesus died during the 9th hour, hanging on the cross. In Norse mythology, god Odin hung for 9 days in Yggdrasil, the tree of life. Yggdrasil grows in the middle of 9 mythological worlds. The 9th President of the United States was William H. Harrison. He was the first president to die in office. According to Dante, there are 9 circles of Christian hell. Mictlan, the underworld in Aztec mythology, consists of 9 levels, just like Xibalba in Mayan. Finally, we say that cats have 9 lives. Superstitions aside, what can we say about composers that followed in Beethoven's footsteps? Did they take the particular qualities of each of his 9 symphonies as an example, apart from dying after writing the 9th? Some of them did. We can find similarities in Schubert's 9th, the sheer scope of it, or the borrowed theme, or Bruckner 9th, Mahler 5th, the opening theme is quite similar, Dvorak 8th, the general character of the piece. Beethoven undoubtedly started the great symphonic tradition. He did not invent it, but due to his extraordinary sensibility to wonders of our universe, to nature so dear to him, to humanity, he was able to tell us truths about that universe and about ourselves we were not aware of before him.